Does evolution fit the evidence? Every time you see a nature program on TV, it mentions or assumes evolution. Evolution is almost universally accepted, both by the scientific community and by the general public, at least in the West. So much so that when people talk about almost any subject today, the theory of evolution is the backdrop to their thinking. What is evolution? The Chambers Dictionary defines evolution in biology as the cumulative changes in the characteristics of living organisms or populations of organisms from generation to generation, resulting in the development of new types of organism over long periods of time. So this evening, when I talk about evolution, I'm talking about one type of organism changing into another, one species changing into another. I'm not talking about variations within one species. There are variations within each species of animal. One example of the variations within a species is all the different breeds of dog that we have today. They're very, very different. We have poodles and Great Danes. We've Rottweilers and Chihuahuas, but they're all still dogs. They're all still the one species. That's not what I'm talking about tonight. Instead, tonight, I'm talking about one species of animal changing into another. I'm talking about a single-celled organism over many, many years, changing into us. Like the Big Bang, evolution doesn't prove there's no God. It assumes there's no God, or at least that God didn't miraculously create the different creatures we have on earth today. It seeks to answer the question, how did all these animals get here? If you assume God didn't miraculously create them, how did all these animals get here? But does it fit the evidence? What is the evidence? And we're told that the strongest evidence for evolution is the fossil record. So that's what we'll think about first. The fossil record. The fossil record is all the preserved remains, impressions and traces of once living things from past ages. Literally millions of fossils have been found and documented. But there are huge gaps in the fossil record. They're sometimes called missing links. Evolution teaches that new types of organism developed over long periods of time. If this is the case, if animals gradually changed from one species into another, you'd expect to see something in between the two species in the fossil record. And since there are so many different creatures, you'd expect to find many, many intermediate or transitional creatures preserved in the fossil record. And yet, there are very, very few fossils that look like transitional forms of anything. And it's not just creationists who are saying this. The famous Harvard paleontologist, and that's just a fossil expert, and evolutionist, Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology." Dr. Colin Patterson, the senior paleontologist at the prestigious British Museum of Natural History, and also author of a book called Evolution, agreed with this when he said, "Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." So when you look at the fossil record, it doesn't look like a record of creatures evolving. But the fossil record also causes other problems for evolution. Evolution teaches that animals evolved over a very long period of time. But in the fossil record, most major animal groups, most major body plans, and fish too, appear suddenly in a very short period of time in what's known as the Cambrian Explosion. In the Cambrian Explosion, a large number of very different animals appear out of the blue all at once, with no evidence of any common ancestor or transitional forms. Here's what Wikipedia says about the Cambrian Explosion. I quote Wikipedia not because I think it's the ultimate source, but because it won't have a Christian bias. It says, "Soon after the emergence of these first multicellular organisms, a remarkable amount of biological diversity appeared over approximately 10 million years in an event called the Cambrian Explosion. Here, the majority of types of modern animals appeared in the fossil record, as well as unique lineages that subsequently became extinct. A remarkable amount of biological diversity appeared. The majority of types of modern animals appeared over a period of 10 million years on a geological timescale. In geological terms, that's a very short time, less than 1% of the age of the Earth. So in the fossil record, most types of modern animals appear at the same time, with no evidence of any common ancestor or transitional forms. Richard Dawkins has said, "It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." From the fossil record, it looks like many, many different kinds of creatures just appeared at once. And then there have been other things found in the fossil record that don't fit with an evolutionary timescale. Things like dinosaur tissue. In the 1990s, Dr. Mary Schweitzer found an unfossilized piece of Tyrannosaurus rex bone, which contained soft, fibrous tissue and complete blood vessels. She didn't believe it was possible when she found it. But when the blood cells were examined, evidence was found of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein that gives red blood cells their colours. These couldn't last more than a few thousand years, certainly not the 65 million years from when evolutionists think dinosaurs last lived. And this wasn't a one-off discovery either. More recently, soft tissue has also been found in Triceratops remains. So that's the evidence from the fossil record. Now we're going to think a little bit about probabilities. Evolution says that new forms of life come about because of random mutations. But the chances of these random mutations producing anything useful can be exceedingly small. Let me give you just one example. Proteins. Proteins are large, complex molecules that play many critical roles in the body. They do most of the work in cells. They're required for the structure, function, and regulation of the body's tissues and organs. Proteins are chains of amino acids. These chains can be thousands of amino acids long. And the sequence of amino acids in the chain determines how the chain will fold up to make the protein. So different proteins have different three-dimensional shapes. And the three-dimensional shape of a protein determines its function. More research needs to be done in this area, but the information we have at present shows that the proportion of amino acid chains that can fold themselves into stable and so useful shapes is astronomically small. Dr. Douglas Axe, a distinguished biologist working at the Centre for Protein Engineering at Cambridge University, did a series of experiments on amino acid chains to estimate how many of them are capable of folding into stable shapes, shapes which hold their shape long enough to be useful. He estimated that the likelihood of a random chain of amino acids being capable of folding into a stable protein that's suitable for a particular function is in the ballpark of 1 in 10 to the power of 77. 10 to the power of 77 is the number 1 with 77 zeros after it. I'll put links with more information about his experiments in the description. If we're very generous and say that every organism that ever lived on Earth in 4.5 billion years produced a random mutation in a protein, what would be the chances of them producing even one new functional protein? It's estimated that there would have been a total of 10 to the power of 40 organisms living on Earth during 4.5 billion years. 10 to the power of 40 is the number 1 with 40 zeros after it. And that's all organisms, bacteria, animals, everything. If they all produced a random mutation in a protein, the chances of producing one new functional protein would be 10 to the power of 40 divided by 10 to the power of 77, which is 1 in 10 to the power of 37. 10 to the power of 37 is 1 with 37 zeros after it. So there's a 1 in 10 to the power of 37 chance of producing one new functional protein by random mutation in all the history of the Earth. Those aren't very good odds. If you were to put every grain of sand from every beach and every desert on earth in one huge pile and randomly pick one grain of sand out of it, you would have far more chance of randomly picking one particular grain of sand from it than you have of producing one new functional protein by random mutation in all the history of the earth. And there are more than 80,000 different proteins in the human body. The more we discover about living organisms, the more we discover how complex they are. And so we're not getting any closer to an answer to the question of how they could have evolved. In fact, the more we discover, the further we are from the answer. And the more we discover about how complex life is, and the harder it is to see how it could have evolved. One top mathematician has said, cells get more and more complex every time we look at them. We see another layer of complexity every time we look at them. So we're actually getting further and further from a complete understanding of them. We're getting further from the goal rather than closer to it. The next line of evidence I want to consider is information. DNA is a complex molecule carrying genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth and repair of all known organisms. DNA encodes information in something like an alphabetic format. There is a vast amount of information embedded in DNA. It's estimated that there's about 1.5 gigabytes of information in the DNA in a single cell of your body. That's the amount of information in 1,500 books in a single cell in your body. Now, the problem for evolution is, where did all that information come from? Evolution says everything is the result of random mutations. So this information must be the result of random mutations. But random mutations tend to degrade information. If you make random changes to computer software, what will happen? It won't work. Random mutations tend to destroy information. There's no way random mutations could produce the vast amount of information in DNA. Does evolution fit the evidence? The missing links mean that the fossil record doesn't look like a record of creatures evolving. The Cambrian Explosion means that most animals seem to have been just planted there without any evolutionary history. Dinosaur tissue shows that dinosaur remains can't be millions of years old. The probability of even one new functional protein forming by random mutation during the history of the Earth is astronomically small. And evolution has no explanation for the incredible amount of information encoded within living creatures. So evolution certainly doesn't fit some of the evidence. Is there anything which fits the evidence better? Secondly, we're going to ask, does the Bible fit the evidence? What does the Bible say? We'll read its account of what happened on days 5 and 6 of the week that God created the world. From Genesis chapter 1. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. There was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. There are different opinions on how long the days in this passage are. The word day has a wide range of meanings in the Hebrew language in which this passage was originally written, a bit like it does in English. We say there are 7 days in a week, using the word day to mean a 24-hour period of time. But we also say things were different in my grandfather's day, using the word day to mean his lifetime. So how long were the days in Genesis? In Hebrew, when the word day is used with a number, like 3 days, or on the third day. It means a 24-hour period of time. Genesis chapter 1 repeatedly tells us that there was an evening and a morning. If there was an evening and a morning each day, it sounds like it's referring to a 24-hour period of time. Also, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 read straight into the rest of Genesis as if it's literal. And Jesus took Adam and Eve to be literal people. So that shows us that the whole account of creation can't be symbolic. Also, Exodus chapter 20 verse 9 says, 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. And God made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that's in them in 6 days, and rested for 1 day. So we are to work for 6 days and rest for 1 day. It sounds like the days are literal 24-hour days. So the Bible tells us that God created each of the different kinds of creatures separately in a couple of days, thousands of years ago. It gives us more details about how he created humans. It says that he formed a man from the dust of the ground. He made Adam not from any other creature, but directly out of the dust of the ground. How does all that measure up to the scientific evidence we have today? Well, it fits perfectly well with what we've thought about so far. The lack of transitional fossils, all kinds of fossils appearing suddenly at once, the dinosaur tissue surviving until today. It also explains how the information in cells got there. God put it there. But how does it fit with other scientific evidence? What about the fossil record? The general consensus today is that the rocks the fossils are found in were laid down gradually over millions of years. Fossils are found in sedimentary rocks, and sedimentary rock can form very quickly. And one example of that is the Mount St. Helens eruption in Washington State in America in 1980. It produced over 7.5 meters. That's 25 feet of finely layered sediment in a single afternoon. Another evidence of fast-forming rocks is fast-forming fossils. If we can see that fossils formed quickly, we know that the rock that they're in must have formed quickly. And there is evidence of fossils forming very quickly. A school of fish has been fossilized while swimming in formation. You can see all the fossilized fish in the right positions. For that to happen, they would have needed to be buried and fossilized extremely quickly. Also, a fossil has been found of one fish in the process of eating another fish. Again, they must have been fossilized extremely quickly. I'll put links to the photos of the fossils in the description. In another case, fossilized fish organs were found. Professor David Martle, a paleontologist at the University of Portsmouth in England, found the fossilized stomach, intestines, and delicate feather-like gills of fish. When he looked closely at the fossil gills under a microscope, he realized that even individual cells had been preserved. So he did an experiment on freshly caught trout to find out how long fish gill cells would stay intact after a fish died. And he discovered that some features of the gills disappeared within several hours of the fish's death. From this, he concluded that the fossilization process was probably taking just a few hours, certainly no more than a few days. In all these cases, fossils must have formed extremely quickly. And for fossils to form quickly, the rock around them must form quickly. So rocks and fossils can form extremely quickly. But when were they formed? We're going to think a bit now about radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is used to estimate the age of rocks and other materials. It works by measuring the quantities of radioactive substances in the rock. A radioactive substance in the rock, it decays gradually over a long period of time into another substance. So if you know the initial proportions of the two substances in the rock and the rate that one substance decays into the other substance, and if you know the final proportions of the two substances in the rock, from that you can calculate the age of the rock. The substances are called isotopes. You don't need to worry about what an isotope is. The rate of radioactive decay does seem to be constant under all circumstances that we can test it. But there are other difficulties with this method. Often it's impossible to know the initial proportions of the isotopes. No one measured them then. There's also the problem of leaching. Basically, some isotopes can leak out of the rocks. All these affect the accuracy of this dating method, meaning that it can give very erratic results. It's a bit like trying to work out when you last put oil in your oil tank. You know there's 100 litres in it now. You calculate that you use 10 litres of oil each day. So when did you last put oil in it? You know the current amount of oil. You know the rate at which you use it. When did you last put oil in it? You can't work it out. You can't work it out if you don't know what the oil level was when you topped it up. You don't know the initial conditions. You could assume that the tank was full, but it mightn't have been. And to make matters worse, the oil has been leaking out, and you've no way of knowing how big the leak is. It suddenly gets very, very difficult to know when you last put oil in the tank. It's a bit like that with radiometric dating. And nevertheless, radiometric dating is widely accepted and used. I suppose there aren't really a lot of other options for dating things. The most well-known radiometric dating method is probably radiocarbon dating, or carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 is a rare radioactive form of carbon. But radiocarbon dating can only date things which are tens of thousands of years old, and not millions of years old. It just decays too fast to be able to measure, to date anything older than that. And no matter how much carbon-14 you started with, it would be undetectable after 1,000,000 years. There are lots of other forms of radiometric dating. The most widely used is potassium-argon dating. But potassium dissolves in water, so it can be leached out of rocks. And argon is a gas, so it also moves quite readily. Both those things would lead to inaccurate results. I'll give you one or two examples of radiometric dating giving ridiculous results. There's a mountain in New Zealand, Mount Ngauruhoe, which erupted and produced lava flows in 1949, 1954, and 1975. Rock samples were taken from each of those lava flows, and potassium-argon dating was used to give a date for when that rock had formed. And it gave a date for each of those flows of 1 million years. But we know they were formed about 70 years ago. Again, lava from Mount St. Helens in the US, which formed between 1980 and 1986, was potassium-argon dated as being millions of years old. And even different samples taken from the same rock can give vastly different results. There are also various lines of scientific evidence which suggest that the Earth is not billions of years old. I'll give you a couple of examples. Rivers carry 450 million tons of salt into the sea every year. That salt remains in the sea when the water evaporates to form clouds. So more salt is going into the sea than is leaving it. And over time, the sea gets saltier and saltier. From how salty the sea is now, we know that this can't have been happening for billions of years. In fact, it can't have been happening for any more than 62 million years. Similarly, helium is pouring into the atmosphere from radioactive decay. But the total amount of helium in the atmosphere is only 1/2000th of what you would expect if the atmosphere were billions of years old. So rocks can form quickly. Radioactive dating can be inaccurate. There is evidence of a young Earth. But how does the rest of the Bible account stand up to scientific analysis? Was there a literal Adam and Eve? And there is scientific evidence that there was. And it was discovered by evolutionists. According to the New Scientist, a scientific research about a decade ago has shown that if you trace back the DNA in the maternally inherited mitochondrial within our cells, all humans have a theoretical common ancestor. This woman has been called mitochondrial Eve. All humans today can trace their mitochondrial DNA back to her. And it's similar with Adam. Our Y chromosomes show that all men currently living are descended from a paternal ancestor known as Y chromosomal Adam. Both those discoveries fit perfectly with a literal Adam and Eve. The Bible tells us that Adam was formed from the dust of the ground. Is that scientifically possible? Do we have the same atomic composition as dirt? Well, actually, we do. The stuff we're made from is all in the soil. 99% of the atoms in the human body are hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. They're all in the soil. In fact, they're the most common organic elements in the soil. They're there in different proportions, but they're all there. And the other elements in our body are found in the soil as well. The Bible also tells us that there was a worldwide flood. Is a worldwide flood scientifically possible? Is there even enough water for a worldwide flood? My father complains that Mount Everest is not the same height that it was when he learnt about it at school. Mountains are getting taller. Plate tectonics and all that. If mountains are getting taller, they were smaller in the past. But would there have been enough water to cover them even if they were lower? And would there be enough water to cover the whole earth? Well, today, water covers half the surface of the earth to a depth of 2 miles. Half the surface of the earth to a depth of 2 miles. If water covers half the surface of the earth to a depth of 2 miles, if the surface of the earth was smooth, that same amount of water would cover the whole surface of the earth to a depth of 1 mile. The whole surface of the earth to a depth of 1 mile. That's higher than a 400-story building all over the entire surface of the earth. There's way more than enough water to flood the whole earth. What would you expect to find if there had been such a catastrophic worldwide flood? You would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. And what do you find? You find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. While we're talking about a worldwide flood, what about Noah's Ark? Is it scientifically plausible? Would it be big enough to get 2 of every kind of animal on board? First, to get one thing clear, Noah's Ark was nothing like the pictures in most children's Bibles. It was absolutely enormous. It was about 135 meters long, 23 meters wide, and 14 meters tall. It's roughly the same number of yards. And it had 3 decks. That gives you a total area bigger than a full-size football pitch. As far as we can tell, it was the largest vessel that ever existed until just over 100 years ago when people started building ships using steel. Although some other ancient ships did come close. The Bible says there were 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, and 7 of some. A kind of animal is not necessarily exactly the same as a species of animal. According to the National Geographic, there are 38 species of cats. And you have lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs and other large cats and lots of species of small cats. But they're all cats. If cat is the kind of animal, there may have been just 2 cats on the ark, from which all the different species of cats that we have today descended. There would have been more than enough space on the ark for a young male and female of each kind of animal. But would the ark have been seaworthy? And the Bible tells us the ark was covered with pitch. Pitch is a thick, gooey substance secreted by trees, and it has exceptional waterproofing qualities. In fact, it has been the most effective and widely used ship waterproofing substance in history. It was widely used for waterproofing in the shipping industry right up until the 1900s. Also, the length to width ratio of the ark, it's about 7:1, was ideal for such a massive, non-powered sea vessel. It's so good that some oil tankers today have the same 7:1 ratio. Studies have shown that those ark dimensions were ideal for handling everything a highly turbulent sea could throw at it, and still balancing the need for inhabitant safety. It would have been extremely difficult to capsize. Does the Bible fit the evidence? Yes, it does. And we know that rock can form very quickly, and that radiometric dating can be unreliable. There are multiple lines of evidence which suggest that the Earth is not billions of years old. We have evidence that fits perfectly with a literal Adam and Eve, formed from the dust of the ground. We know that there's more than enough water for a worldwide flood, and that the ark was seaworthy and able to hold an enormous number of animals. The Bible account does stand up under scientific analysis. So examining the scientific evidence raises major doubts about evolution, but it gives a lot of support to what the Bible says. Next time, we'll think about evidence of design in nature.